couldn't explain it at first. On the surface, everything looked fine. She was attractive, confident, even charming in moments. Sometimes she made you feel wanted, even special. But underneath all of that, there was this feeling you couldn't shake. A quiet tension in your chest, a constant second-guessing in your mind. You found yourself replaying conversations long after they ended, wondering what you said wrong. You started watching your words more carefully. You adjusted your tone, your timing, your reactions, all just to keep things smooth. And somehow, no matter how careful you became, it was never enough. If you feel this subtle anxiety, this emotional instability around her, you're not overthinking. You're responding to something real. And most men miss it because it doesn't look like obvious toxicity in the beginning. It feels like confusion, like imbalance, like you're slowly losing your footing without knowing why. But here's the truth you need to hear clearly. You were not the problem. What you were experiencing wasn't a lack of effort or a failure to communicate or something you needed to fix in yourself. It was a dynamic built on emotional imbalance, and that imbalance wasn't accidental. It was created. What makes this difficult to recognize is that it doesn't always come with obvious red flags. There's no constant yelling, no clear abuse in the beginning. Instead, it shows up in how you feel around her. Because your emotional state becomes the signal. And one of the first signs is this quiet but persistent feeling that you're being evaluated. Not appreciated, not accepted, evaluated. You start to feel like you're being measured in ways that are never fully explained. One day, you're doing everything right. She's warm, engaged, even affectionate. The next day, the same behavior from you feels like it annoys her. She pulls back, becomes distant, slightly cold. There's no clear reason for the shift. So your mind tries to fill in the gaps. You start asking yourself what changed. You analyze your last interaction. You look for mistakes. And slowly, without realizing it, you take on the responsibility of stabilizing the relationship. This is where the control begins. Because when someone creates inconsistency like this, your focus shifts away from clarity and toward approval. You stop asking, "Is this healthy for me?" And you start asking, "How do I get back to where things felt good?" That shift is everything. It puts you in a position where you're chasing emotional stability that she controls. And over time, this creates another feeling that many men ignore at first. You feel drained, even when nothing dramatic is happening. You could spend time with her, have a normal conversation, even laugh, but afterward, there's this quiet exhaustion. Not physical, but mental and emotional. That's not random. That's what happens when your nervous system is constantly adjusting. You're reading between the lines. You're monitoring her tone. You're trying to stay in sync with unpredictable emotional responses. That level of awareness takes energy. And the more you invest in it, the more disconnected you become from your own natural state. Another sign shows up in how conflict feels. It doesn't feel like two people trying to understand each other. It feels like you're being turned into the problem. Even when you're calm, even when you're trying to communicate clearly, the conversation somehow shifts. Your concern becomes an accusation. Your perspective becomes overreacting. Your feelings become something that needs to be corrected or dismissed. And after enough of these interactions, something subtle starts to happen. You stop bringing things up. Not because they don't matter, but because you've learned that expressing them leads to more confusion, more tension, or even emotional withdrawal from her. So you adapt. You stay quiet. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. But internally, that silence builds pressure. Because your needs didn't disappear, they were just pushed aside. This is how emotional roles start forming in these dynamics. She becomes the one who defines what's acceptable, and you become the one who adjusts. Not out of weakness, but out of a desire to keep the connection stable. But stability never truly comes, because the rules keep shifting. And that leads to one of the most important feelings to pay attention to. You start losing clarity about yourself. You question your reactions. You doubt your instincts. You wonder if you're being too sensitive, too demanding, or just not understanding her properly. This is where many men get stuck the longest, because they assume that if they can just figure it out, things will improve. But the confusion isn't something you can solve with better communication or more patience. It's part of the dynamic itself. A narcissistic pattern often depends on keeping the other person slightly off balance. Not completely broken, not completely aware, just enough uncertainty to keep you engaged, trying, adjusting. And when you step back and look at it clearly, another pattern becomes visible. Her interest in you feels tied to how much attention, validation, or emotional energy you're giving. When you're focused on her, when you're responsive, when you're available, things feel smoother. But the moment you pull back, even slightly, her behavior shifts. She may become distant, or suddenly more attentive, or even subtly critical. This isn't random. It's a response to control being challenged. Because in a balanced connection, your independence doesn't threaten the bond. But in an imbalanced one, your independence disrupts it. And that's why you may have felt a strange pressure to stay emotionally engaged, even when you were tired. Because pulling back didn't feel neutral. It felt like it would create a reaction. Over time, this creates a quiet form of emotional dependency. Not because you need her, but because you've been conditioned to associate your sense of calm with her behavior. If she's warm, you feel okay. If she's distant, you feel unsettled. And that connection becomes hard to break. This is where awareness starts to change things. Because once you recognize that your emotional state has been tied to her unpredictability, you can begin to separate the two. You can start noticing the patterns without immediately reacting to them. You can feel the shift in her behavior without assuming it's something you need to fix. And that's a powerful shift, because it brings you back to yourself. It allows you to ask a different kind of question. Not, how do I make this work? But, what is this actually doing to me? When you ask that honestly, without minimizing your experience, the answer becomes clear. It's draining you. It's pulling you away from your natural confidence. It's making you doubt things that used to feel simple. And once you see that clearly, something important happens. You stop trying to win the dynamic. You start stepping out of it. That doesn't mean reacting with anger or trying to prove a point. It means reducing your emotional investment in something that isn't stable. It means no longer chasing clarity from someone who creates confusion. It means observing instead of absorbing. And this is where boundaries begin to form. Not loud, aggressive boundaries. Calm, steady ones. You don't explain yourself excessively. You don't argue to be understood. You don't overextend your energy trying to maintain something that keeps destabilizing you. You simply stop participating in the parts of the dynamic that cost you your peace. And at first, that can feel uncomfortable, because you've been used to engaging, adjusting, trying. So stepping back feels unfamiliar. But that discomfort is different from the anxiety you felt before. It's not confusion, it's growth. And as you stay consistent with that shift, something else becomes clear. Her behavior doesn't define your worth. Her approval doesn't determine your value. And her inconsistency isn't something you need to decode. It's something you need to recognize and respond to with clarity. Because the goal was never to understand her completely. The goal is to understand what you're experiencing and what you're willing to accept. And when you reach that point, the dynamic loses its hold on you. Not because she changes, but because you do. You're no longer trying to stabilize something unstable. You're no longer measuring yourself against unpredictable standards. You're no longer ignoring how you feel just to keep things going. Instead, you become steady, grounded, clear. And from that place, your decisions change. You don't chase mixed signals. You don't stay where you feel consistently unsettled. You don't ignore the quiet tension in your body just because there are occasional good moments. You trust the overall pattern, not isolated highs. And that trust becomes your protection. Because once you've seen this dynamic clearly, you can't unsee it. You recognize the signs earlier. You pay attention to how you feel, not just how things look. And most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying to connect with someone else. That's where real strength shows up. Not in enduring confusion, not in trying harder, but in choosing clarity over attachment to something that isn't healthy. And when you move forward from this place, your relationships start to feel different. Not because they're perfect, but because they're stable, consistent, mutually respectful. You don't feel like you're being evaluated. You don't feel like you're walking on emotional edges. You don't feel drained just from being around the person. Instead, you feel calm. You feel understood. You feel like you can be yourself without constantly adjusting. And that's the difference. That's what a balanced connection actually feels like. So if you've been carrying that quiet anxiety, that constant second guessing, that emotional exhaustion, there's nothing wrong with you. You weren't failing. You were responding to a dynamic that was never built on stability. And now that you can see it clearly, you don't have to stay in it. You can step back. You can reset. You can choose something better. Not by forcing anything, but by refusing to ignore what you feel. And that's where peace starts to come back. Not all at once, but steadily, as you return to yourself.